Welcome to the Arab Women Social Impact Series session on looking at business through an SDG lens. I'd like to start first by just sharing a few words, and Mary's t-shirt actually speaks to that as well. We obviously are, our hearts go out to the people of Lebanon in full solidarity to what's happening over there. It's heartbreaking, to say the least. So we really hope that this tragic incident passes, and I trust that the people of Lebanon will rise from it, just as they've done numerous times before. So let's get started. Today we're talking about a very important topic, which is the importance of sustainability and the SDGs, which has come to the forefront of priorities of many organizations. And over the years, a growing number of entrepreneurs have been taking action through driving and designing initiatives with the SDGs in mind. These enterprises are purpose-driven, and they focus on the creation of economic and social and environmental value, rather than just shareholders' maximization of profit. So basically, we all have a role to play: the private sector, public sector, nonprofits, individuals, community service organizations, civil society organizations. We all have a role to play. And for us to achieve real change, we need to measure what we do. We need to think of our surroundings, of the people and the planet, and not just profit. So today, we are very lucky to have three speakers who are all passionate about impact, and will talk to us about, can we really achieve this balance between profit and purpose? And I'll start by introducing Reem. Reem Khouri is the co-founder and CEO of WISE, which is an impact analytics software solution that enables organizations to aggregate their data in real time and analyze it. WISE was selected in 2019 by the World Economic Forum, actually, as one of the 100 startups contributing to the fourth industrial revolution. She's also the founding partner of Kamen, an impact design company that has worked in the Middle East, Asia, and Africa with governments, companies, and NGOs, designing models for exponential economic and social returns. Reem is obviously award-winning. She serves on numerous boards, including 3BL, Ruwad. She's a faculty member at Amani Institute in Nairobi, Kenya. She's also a board member, or actually a board of trustees member, of the Welfare Association, Al Ta'awun. And she previously worked with Aramex. She was recognized as one of the world's 100 most influential Arabs under 40 by Arabian Business Magazine in 2015 and 2016. And selected as a young global leader of the World Economic Forum in 2018. Welcome, Reem. Thank you for being with us today. I move on to Noura. Noura is the co-founder and CEO of SITTI Social Enterprise, with the purpose to empower refugee women through employment and enhance their opportunity to become financially independent and self-sustainable. I love what SITTI does. Noura also co-founded an NGO in 2009 called Hopes for Women in Education to provide higher education scholarships, skills training, and online language development through Banat Connect in the process. She worked for several years with UN agencies in Jordan, focusing on education, international development, and relief services. Noura, thank you for being with us today. And last but not least, we are lucky to have Mary Nazel Bataine with us today. Mary is the executive chairperson and founder of 17 Ventures, working to push forward her vision for a fairer world by way of responsible investments and advisory services. She heads up the CEF Jordan Growth and Impact Fund, which she has co-launched under 17 Ventures, partnering with Washington-based CEF. Mary started out her career as a British barrister, focusing on social justice causes. She's also a well-known business leader in the hospitality industry in Jordan, having founded a homegrown brand of landmark hotel chains in Jordan and expanding it into occupied East Jerusalem. Mary was also named one of Forbes' most powerful Arab women for several years, was featured as a Forbes cover story. And in 2019, she was named Jordan's top businesswoman by Jordan Business Magazine. She is a member of several high-profile institutions on their boards, including Injaz, a member of YPO and the IWF, and she was also selected as a young global leader for the World Economic Forum. So thank you, ladies, for being here. Good thing we started with the intro. It takes a bit of time, but it's definitely worth it for the audience to know who are with us today. We're very proud to have three awesome Arab women like yourselves. So let's start with Mary to help us set the scene. Mary, you have firsthand experience in transformations of commercial enterprises into operationally effective and SDG aligned businesses. Mm-hmm. So why an SDG fund versus another traditional VC fund, if you will? And I'll start with sharing the slides to help you with that. So over to you.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on this panel. You're doing an amazing job with She is Arab, and it's really an honor to be with Noura and Reem. They're two women that I really respect and learn from every day. So really excited about this. And like you said, we're going through hard times, but I think we all need to find a way to keep going. So just a little bit of background before we jump into the answer to that question. So my background is in social justice, political justice, and human rights law. And for the past, let's say 15 years, I've really been working using those tools of political activism and legal activism. But the purpose has always been the same. It's about social justice, it's about equity, it's about fairness. And in the course of my career, I also got involved with the family business, which you correctly described. I aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals with a focus on 5 and 8. And I also got involved with a social enterprise in the Gaza camp called SEP Jordan. And that really showed me how business, if you change the way you approach business and you change the way you approach investing, you fundamentally can make a huge impact. So it's really about now, for me, through 17 Ventures, how can we more effectively use capital as a tool towards equality and towards equity? And so our framework at 17 Ventures are the Sustainable Development Goals, as you can tell by the name 17. And really the purpose of 17 Ventures, beyond just launching, impact funds and advisory services, is really to start a conversation within our region about the future of capitalism, social return on investment, conscious capitalism. All these things fundamentally mean similar things. I mean, they're nuanced, but the understanding there is that we can't continue business as usual. So really, this is what we're trying to disrupt. What does capital mean? How do you actually make investments? And that's where Reem comes in. How do you actually measure investments? So I've chosen a quote from one of the authors who has really inspired me over the past couple of years, Jed Emerson, in his latest book, The Purpose of Capital. And it's really talking about this new emergence of a new form of conscious capitalism. So just moving a bit to the SDGs themselves, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So essentially, these are 17 goals that as humanity, we are meant to achieve by the year 2030. And what they're supposed to do is really set a blueprint or a map, a universal one that can allow us as citizens of this planet to work towards this better world where you have SDG 5, gender equality, where you have SDG 4, quality education, and so on. And the beauty of the SDGs, and of course they should be localized, is that they have specific targets. So you have a sense of where you are and where you need to go. The issue that we're facing globally is there's an immense financing gap that we are facing in terms of achieving the SDGs. And we really need to be working on channeling more capital and more investments towards the SDGs. And really that's what 17 Ventures is also about. Just before we went live, we were also having this conversation about, given the pandemic, do we need to look at these SDGs again? I mean, if you just look at SDG 10, inequality, I mean, the pandemic within the past couple of months has increased inequality in every level whether it comes to gender, poverty between countries, the income gap, which is one of the biggest issues we're facing today. Do we just need to have another look at the SDGs just to make sure that they are still relevant in their entirety? Or do they need to be adapted to the new COVID-19 world that unfortunately we're living through? I'll end there somewhat for now.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Mary, for sharing this. Yes, as you rightly said, you know, I believe the SDGs as they currently are form a perfect framework to build on. And definitely, as with any framework, it needs to be revisited from time to time, and priorities need to be revisited as well. There are quite a few SDGs, I believe, that are main drivers to and cut across multiple sectors. For example, gender equality, which us as She is Arab are really focused on as well. These also need to be revisited because I believe, you know, the women, what their leadership models and what they really bring to the table as well in such catastrophes or pandemics has risen to the surface, and there's a lot to be learned from that. So thank you so much for this intro. I move on to Noura to give us an intro on SITTI, which literally translates to my grandma. And tell us, Noura, why did you decide to do what you do? And why refugees? Why women? Why did you choose this industry? Would love to hear your story.
Thank you, Sama. Thank you, Reem and Mary. It's a pleasure to be on here with everybody. So I feel like every time I think of the story of how SITTI came to be born, I almost feel like it was handed to me. And it was something that, you know, me and my co-founder, we just ran with it. But I've been working in the refugee community for over 10 years. And I did my master's and specialized in forced migration and refugee studies. And so I was always keen to want to work with refugees and understand more kind of the dynamics. And being someone that lived in the diaspora, I would say, I grew up in Canada. I never really lived the refugee life. So for me, going back and really understanding, you know, going to Jordan and visiting the refugee camps was something that was very intriguing for me, but it was also incredibly amazing to see the resiliency of some of these people that you know, built generations in these camps and continue to hold on to their identity. So it was something I held very, very strongly to. Like you mentioned, I was working mainly within the education side in the refugee community, working with refugee women and scholarship education. And I would say 5 years into working with SITTI, there became an opportunity of refugee women that were skilled in olive oil soap making, and they kind of needed help pushing it to market. And I knew, and at the time when I connected with my co-founder later, was that on top of the fact that, you know, we were working with the poorest refugee camp in Jordan, refugees in general are disadvantaged in their positioning and their ability to be able to like market themselves. And so we came in with this sense of how can we kind of take this and expand it. And so it moves on to, if you go to the next slide. Yeah, so it goes towards, you know, what we eventually became. So it slowly grew organically, started with a single bar of soap, but now we kind of see ourselves as this lifestyle brand committed to the self-reliance of refugee and displaced communities through long-term employment opportunity and skill development training, empowered by an inclusive global economy. And we focus on 3 pillars, which is educate, employ, and empower. Because we really feel that these are 3 elements that we work in on a continuous basis, and it touches on the SDG goals that we highlight. Some of which are quality education, reduce inequalities, decent work and economic growth, etc. And I can go into them in more detail. But yeah, for those that don't know the Erash refugee camp and are not familiar, it is one of the poorest refugee camps. It was founded in 1968, started with about, I want to say, 11,000 refugees. Today, I think the number is inaccurate. I don't know if that's an accurate number, but latest numbers are around over 30,000 residents that live in the camp and the peripheries of the camp as well. And majority, and I would say over the majority of the refugee camp actually lives below the national poverty line. And you know, they continue to face extreme inequalities, particularly because they don't hold citizenship. They live on temporary passports, and so their ability to attain and have access to jobs normally is not the same as, let's say, a normal citizen. And that's why our positioning and the fact that we actually work out of the refugee camp itself is ever more crucial. And organizations like SITTI, and as well there's SEP, who also works in the camp. They also do incredible work. But our placement, I would say, in the camp is critical, because it really means that we're bringing these opportunities to the camp, as opposed to having them leave the camp and become even more disadvantaged because of, you know, being geographically kind of placed to access jobs.
Absolutely. No, that's I mean, honestly, kudos. This is amazing work, a great match for an area that truly needs help, especially with the lack of access to job opportunities there, and with your focus on women in particular. And we'll get into that later during the session. But I'll move on to Reem now to tell us about the why behind whys. So Reem, you describe what you do as leveraging technology to enable higher transparency on disbursements of funds, compliance with governance standards, streamlining of reporting and data analytics for insights, and of course, higher financial, economic, social, environmental return on investment. It's a new player in this space, I would say. There's a lot to be said. I know myself, you know, it's been a crazy couple of years for you. So we would love to hear more about whys.
Thank you Samar. It's a privilege to be with all of you. Samar, I thought you were going to start leading when you introduced me by saying that we're actually childhood friends before anything. Yeah. I think that's the most important thing.
I decided to keep that as a secret, but there you go.
Privilege to be and to consider Mary and Noura also as friends and colleagues.
Absolutely.
Extremely inspirational women. As well as you, Samar, of course. And so the why behind whys actually is very much correlated with what we're seeing in the world. And it's very much correlated with what we're seeing in the region as well. There's a there's a business answer, but there's also a very emotional answer to all of this. And that's, we were fed up. It's not just me, it's me and the team. We were fed up of hearing about hundreds of millions of dollars coming in aid or in investment and not seeing the change that's supposed to happen. We're fed up of actually seeing what's happening in Lebanon, the lack of governance, the corruption, whether at the government level or at the business level, or at the not-for-profit level, of not truly seeing the change, but seeing so many resources, so much money being spent, and not seeing the actual return on that investment. And the reality of the matter is the return of that investment is affecting every single life on the ground. And so what we initially, when we started WISE, we said, we want to be able to track exactly what people are doing, where the money's going, what's the change it's creating. And then but there is a business reason behind this as well. It's that when you don't track, when you don't measure what you're doing, then by definition, you're creating inefficiencies and waste instead of actually making decisions based on evidence. When you're not collecting data, you're actually operating in the blind. Because and especially with COVID-19, it showed us that when you're no longer having that face-to-face interaction with your stakeholders and everything's gone virtual, you need the data to be able to understand what they're feeling and what's happening and what's changing in their lives. We also really wanted to build the evidence and the correlation between sustainable business practices and growth. we wanted to completely dismantle the myth that sustainability is a cost. And we wanted people to start seeing it as the investment and as the direct correlation to an improved return on investment and to a driver for growth. And so there's so many different whys, but when we come and talk about startups and social enterprises, maybe as well, when you're starting to build something from scratch, you're also starting to think, you know, like, I want to build a good product and a good team and good processes, and no one says I want to sign a, you know, a semi-mediocre shareholders agreement. Everything has to be, you know, up to the best standards. And then what I think people are very they're not aware that the SDGs is about actually those best standards, right? So if you want the best in governance and the best in structure and the best in team, you need to actually invest in the culture as well. And so what makes your company good are SDG number 5 and 8 and 9 and 10 and 12 as a company. And that's just simply having an efficient supply chain and having an efficient model and having an inclusive culture and a good work environment. It really doesn't have to be extremely complex. And I believe that companies and organizations in general, whether they're for-profit or not for-profit, need to think about it as an investment in their future, in the well-being, in the intelligence, and the growth. If you take us to the next slide, Samad, just to close on this, is we've done quite a bit of research on what makes companies, not just companies, but organizations in general, resilient. And we came to the conclusion that what makes an organization resilient is not just about deployment of capital in a smart way or having enough cash, especially with COVID-19, but about values, transparency and communication and action, the trust that we are actually inclusive of all stakeholders when we make our decisions. And most importantly, that we understand there's direct correlation between us and the stakeholders, which COVID-19 completely highlighted. And when we've done a free employee well-being toolkit that actually just proved that for us. From the responses we got, most organizations wanted to focus not just on proper management of cash, but on actually how can they innovate and be creative so that they remain relevant at times where COVID-19 disrupted everything. But the well-being survey, the employee well-being survey showed us that 50% of the employees are extremely stressed, 44% worry about losing their jobs, 69% felt like they needed new skills. And to us, this is SDG 8, right? And so the idea that just as a very basic concept, if you adopt SDG 8 as an organization, by definition, you become more resilient. So why is truly that, is give you the data to help you become more resilient by doing what's smart for your business and what can drive your growth, but also doing what's smart and good for all of your stakeholders and the community in general, and hoping never having scenarios like what we're seeing in Lebanon happen anymore.
100%, 100%. And I believe that the way you put it sums it up beautifully, because I believe there's a lack of people or businesses seeing the value or the shared value that is actually out there. And the challenge has always been understanding the social return on investment and actually measuring it. So companies obviously see it very clearly. They see an ROI, the books look great, you know, so they go for it. But how can we encourage, you know, businesses to venture into purpose-driven initiatives if they cannot actually see the impact, the measurement? So I'll move on to Mary here to tell us the difference between an impact investor and basically what is a social entrepreneur and what is an impact investor. Why have you ventured into impact investing? What's different about this business model?
No, that's a really great question. I'll just start just addressing this slide in particular, because I thought it was useful just to set a very, very basic framework on the spectrum of different businesses. So just here on the left side, you have, the traditional charity model, and then on the far right hand side, you have the traditional business that doesn't really think about impact. What I think people in my sort of movement are trying to do is have people gather more around the middle, where it's profit and purpose, measurable purpose. So a social entrepreneur, for me, is an entrepreneur who's explicitly and sort of intentionally trying to solve a social problem. I would also add an environmental problem, because you find increasingly entrepreneurs that are trying to address, food security or energy issues or social inequality. An impact investor, again, there's a spectrum, and I could have designed a similar slide on what that means. But I think it really comes down to that intentionality of the impact that you're aiming to achieve through that investment. So it's not a byproduct, it's intentional from the beginning. So for us, let's talk about the Steve Jordan Growth and Impact Fund, which is a fund that I've been designing for the past 2 years and we're raising for at the moment. The explicit purpose behind the Jordan Growth and Impact Fund, which is looking at Jordan and partly Palestine, is to push forward SDG 5 and SDG 8. So that is clearly the impact we want to achieve. And the tool that we're using to achieve that impact is something that we've developed internally, which is called the SDG Inclusion Scorecard. So this scorecard enables us to go into company X, let's say at screening, and give them a score based on how do they deal with women, how do they deal with people with disabilities, how do they have programs for youth, do they have training programs. We're looking at inclusion generally, and the purpose would be through the course of the investment, we need to push up that rating. And the unique feature of the Jordan Fund, which I hope other impact funds will consider adopting, is that the investment team, the fund manager, is incentivized on the impact that they achieved. And I think this is really, really important, because why should a fund manager ultimately care if they're achieving impact? If they're driven purely financially, they're not mission driven. So what we are doing is you can unlock a percentage of what's called the carried interest based on how many jobs you create and how much you push forward the SDG Inclusion Scorecard. So I think the key for impact investing is for it to be measurable, and this is where Reem comes in. If you don't have that element of being measurable and setting certain KPIs, then you risk the impact washing that I think we're all worried about. Call yourself a social enterprise in order to unlock certain grants where really you're not, or call yourself an impact investor when really you have a typical sort of VC mindset. So I think this measurability of social impact, which we can see in the top of the screen, is really the key differentiating factor.
That's amazing. And I think, Mary, you probably came up with the SDG inclusion scorecard based on your experience as well, from creating a family-friendly environment for workers. I read so much about your achievements there. So I applaud you for initiating that and for supporting women to get back to work. And I think a lot of businesses need to take this responsibility upon themselves and drive similar initiatives. Mary, you also spoke at the Global Impact Investing Network Conference last year, specifically on the potential of refugee lens investing. So while it's been trending to talk about gender lens investing and so on, you talked about a completely different topic. You're one of the biggest supporters of, I believe, SITTI and SEP, as mentioned throughout the conversation. So you seem to believe that this could be a solution to a major burden, or what's looked at as being a burden in the region to regional economies. I would love for you to share your thoughts on this in particular, refugee lens investing.
Sure. I mean, this is a theme that I'm really excited about. And I think that I've seen through SITTI and through SEF Jordan, which is another social enterprise in the Gaza camp, and other social enterprises that operate in other refugee camps, how you can actually invest in refugees or invest in refugee lens businesses. And it makes sense to do so. It's not just the moral thing to do, it's the right thing to do. And the exciting thing is, through my partner, SEEF, which is a global impact investor, we have now designed and launched something called the Globally Displaced Peoples Fund, which has a broad refugee lens that we're using to source and make investments. So a refugee lens investment for us means companies that are founded by refugees, managed by refugees, have employees that are refugees, service refugees or host communities. And I think it's really important to always keep host communities in the mix, because at the end of the day, we're trying to build, you know, something inclusive. And we're trying through this fund to change that ugly narrative that refugees are a burden. They're actually, they could be you, they could be me, they are a blessing. They're just in this situation because of a politically dysfunctional global system. And because we've failed to, you know, make any concrete action, you know, when it comes to SDG 16. So we have one of the biggest crises that the planet is facing, which is the global refugee crisis. So how can we change this fundamentally? And investment is one way. I mean, obviously there's political rights that need to be taken into consideration. And this is something that I always say, that yes, we're investing in refugees, but that doesn't mean that they don't have rights in international law, whether it's to return or compensation or restitution. But the fact is, resettlement is taking a very long time. UNHCR, despite its best efforts, isn't able to resettle people. So in the meantime, people deserve to live in dignity, and they deserve to be part of the formal working system. And we essentially need to make the pie bigger. So we change that narrative that the refugees are taking our jobs or taking from the pie. We need to make the pie bigger.
There's clearly a huge opportunity there. And we hosted a webinar last month with someone from UNHCR who spoke specifically about the funding gap that they're facing. And I think the challenges are immense and they're not for them alone to handle. So we all have a role to play. Again, entrepreneurship, you know, comes in beautifully. Noura, you currently employ over 15 full-time refugee women in the camp in Jerash. You're managing this all the way from Canada, which I don't know how you do it, but it's amazing. So now that we've learned about the SDGs and Mary has set the scene for us with that, tell us about the SDGs that you target, that you address as SITTI, and how you've addressed each one of them, please.
I should mention, thank you, Samak. I should mention that going into the social enterprise or running or starting SITTI, it was never something where we're like, okay, guys, what SDGs are we going to tick off? Like it's never really like that with a business, I would say, or a social business. For us, it started really with the intention. Mary touched on this really, and it was really about, okay, why are we doing this? You know, we weren't reinventing the wheel. We weren't introducing something to market that wasn't there before. There, you know, soap making and soaps in the industry has been around, especially in the Middle East, for centuries. For us, it was really about, you know, that economic dignity, that creating this sense of how these were women that we saw were incredibly resilient, that wanted to make something out of their lives, that we were like, okay, this bar of soap, if it may be, was just a means, was just a way for them to get started, was a way to incorporate the skills that they've learned and push it forward. And just to kind of go back from like a refugee lens, and while we're on that theme, you know, the average lifespan of a refugee is what, 25, 30 years according to UNHCR. And so we know, especially working in the region, both working with UNRWA and now as an advisory council member with UNHCR in Canada, the refugee situation is not going to disappear tomorrow, right? And particularly in the refugee communities and Palestinian refugee communities, Palestinian refugees are kind of exhausted from the international aid. They're looking for a means to, you know, get a job. It's not because they're lazy and they don't want to work and they just want to keep spreading their hands because they want more. On the contrary, it's just because opportunities have not really been handed to them fairly, because of their disadvantage of where they have been, and the socio-political kind of situation that surrounds them. And so when we look at it from that perspective, and you look at refugees and the precariousness, I would say, and the protracted situation, we know it's not going to go away. And while aid continues to be there, and we're not saying that social enterprises will come and replace aid, that's not the point here. The point here is we need to create new solutions and new ways to come into these communities and offer different types of support. And so while aid can be there, I think there's also opportunities to, like Mary mentioned, investing into these communities where you can really, empower individuals, women, men, to really make something out of their lives beyond saying, I'm a refugee, I'm poor, give me money. Like we need to move beyond the conversation, because I feel like even the community themselves, they're tired of it. Like they don't want to resort to that anymore. They want to look for opportunities where there are people, there are companies and organizations investing in them. And then moving beyond just, let's do a bunch of training in the camps and then leaving them with certificates and certificates of trainings without.
It's not sustainable. It's obviously not sustainable. It's a one-off intervention that's not sustainable. So, I mean, that's what I love about your approach. You've created something, even though it may not have been intentional, you have actually addressed, 5 of the 17 sustainable development goals. And I mean, we would like to call on startups and entrepreneurs to actually make it intentional, to actually refer to the SDG Compass Guide or whatever resources and tools are out there to help them integrate it within their business strategy from the outset. But in your journey, it started differently. So tell us a little bit about these SDGs, please.
So for us, and I won't highlight every single one of them, we'll highlight just a couple. So quality education was, I guess, it started with just our work in the camp, particularly with Hopes for Women Education. And education was, a cornerstone to our work. It was how we started communicating. It was kind of the gap that we were trying to fill to make sure that women were not isolated from higher education because of being economically disadvantaged. And so it was one thing led to another. I remember we actually hosted all of our book clubs at the Landmark. Mary was one of the biggest supporters of Hopes. When it first started, and I remember she was like, okay, what do you need? What can our hotel do to support you? And it was one of the biggest things, because sometimes you just need it. That's where kind of I saw the private sector merge in to say,
what can we do to help?
Exactly. What can we do? What do we have in terms of resources that we can lend that can also support the activities that you're running? And that was so incredible, because it set an example and a role model for other businesses to be like, oh, look, we may not be able to support monetarily, but maybe we can do in kind, or maybe we can do other ways. And I think companies need to start thinking from that lens, start thinking of what do we have in terms of resources, both employee resources, actual physical land, facilities that can be used in a positive social lens, right? So that's in terms of quality education. And gender equality is next, if you go. And I think gender equality has always been at the pillar. We hire mainly women. I don't want to say only women. We hire mainly women. Our Women's Center exclusively hires women. We also work with disabled men in the refugee camp out of the rehabilitation center, where we work with them. But gender equality is huge for us. It's at the core. Every single one of our women artisans are the sole breadwinners of their families. And that's huge, because for us, it means that this is a livelihood for, the families that we are supporting, and, the salaries that we're giving out is not just helping that one individual, it's creating that ecosystem. And I think it's important to look at it. And maybe this is where Reem can kind of chime in of, measuring impact is not on that one person that you hire. It's that one person that is surrounded by a family, and that family is surrounded with the community that they work in, whether you're creating role models or whatever it is. So decent work and economic growth. So earning a fair wage is really important. Focusing on working in a sustainable way, making sure that we are keeping in mind the community when we're working. So when we first started, one of the things we wanted to do is create almost kind of like a daycare inside of the workshop. So we actually created like a mini daycare, because we were like, okay, what if women had children and they had nowhere to put their children while they were working? What would they do? So we created almost a small kind of childcare facility with an ECE that would be there, that would take care of the kids while the women were working. And these are just kind of some things that we were thinking of. Responsible consumption and production. This started actually most recently in terms of tracking. So I'm in Toronto, and in North America, what's really trending more, I would say, than more common are B Corps or B corporations. And so one of the things as part of the B corporation or becoming certified was creating an employee well-being employee toolkit, for example, like something that Ree mentioned. Working on identifying and really measuring and making sure, let's say, your employees are well-being is kind of at the forefront. And then responsible consumption for us in production meant, are we tracking our water? What's our impact on the environment, etc.? These were questions that we may have not asked in the beginning, but in the process of looking at becoming certified, our questions we started kind of incorporating, saying, okay, we need to start creating those measurements for ourselves internally so that we're able to better track. And again, this could be something that companies don't have the answers right away, but it's something that we organically were building on as we were looking to better track ourselves internally and better present ourselves through transparent means for kind of our stakeholders.
So I think that's a perfect point to move on to actual measurement. And thank you for measuring the B Corp. I mean, there are multiple certifications out there that we should take into consideration. And Reem will mention a few through her slide on what to measure. So what should we measure, Reem? What is social impact measurement? How can we measure this data to actually drive our growth as responsible businesses?
So the simplest way to answer, because I think intentionality was mentioned quite a bit, I think you need to measure if your intention is happening or not on the ground. Literally, that's it. I would start with, I think one of the biggest mistakes people think about is that they think there is one way of measuring, right? And the first thing you learn when you work in the impact space is that impact is extremely subjective. It's about your own logic to creating change. And it's also about the stakeholders' perception and experiencing that change. And so one, there is subjectivity to defining what's the change you're trying to create. And the very first step to measurement is to actually articulate the change that you're trying to create. And you don't articulate it on your own, you articulate it as well. And so you start with articulating it to yourself, that's the intentionality, but then you also articulate it with your stakeholders. The second part is we actually do reverse engineering. We're saying if that change is gonna happen, what do we need to be doing? What do we need, what kind of prerequisites do we need to have in place? Which brings us to the second biggest challenge we see. It's that people measure inputs and outputs, what they put in and what comes out. But that's not change. Change, impact, you have to measure outcomes. And so and KPMG actually had done research and they said 93% of companies measure inputs and outputs.
Wow,
less than
huge.
Yes, less than 30% discuss outcomes or impact, and less than 20% quantify it. And the issue is that actually, if you want to look at sustainability and SDGs as a driver for growth in business, what will help you sell your business are the outcomes. It's not the outputs. And so I'm going to give an example of that. But before I go into this, for this slide, before we move forward, the idea that there's only one way of measurement was one of the mistakes we made when we started WISE, right? So originally I said, you know what? People use international standards. They want those benchmarks and baselines, and this is what we're going to do. UN Global Reporting Initiative, the SDGs, IFC, ESG standards, the environmental, social, and governance standards, IRIS, and we're good. And, you know, I had like 300 or 400, 500 indicators on the platform and went to the market trying to sell, and everyone's like, but I don't want to, like, I want to measure if what I do is creating change, right? And so immediately we started actually thinking, okay, we need to work on our library differently. If you're in the banking industry, what do you measure? If you're a tech startup, what do you measure? If you're a VC fund, what do you measure? If you're working on entrepreneurship or financial inclusion or gender equality, what is it that you need to be looking at? If you're in Saudi and you want to access government contracts, you need to show that you're aligning with the country's strategy and so, and with Saudi Vision 2030. So you want to track according to that. And so first big lesson we had as a startup was, let's not even, there isn't one way of looking at things, and it's extremely subjective. But going to the outcomes, if you can take me to the slide, I have, yeah, so these are slides from SDG Impact Jordan. Rasha Manna very graciously and generously shared with all the partners the different examples of how businesses in Jordan, Landmark was definitely one of the very first case studies in there, but Luminous, because they're our client, I wanted to highlight some of the work that they do. And Luminous, as you know, is a vocational a technical university that is actually quite focused on reducing inequalities and providing decent work opportunities for its graduates. But what was very interesting is you can say Luminous graduates, you know, 20,000 students every year. Mm-hmm. That's an output. What ends up happening is, and it's a fantastic number to say, right? And it's an important number to look at, but it's not enough. It's not telling me if they're finding jobs. It's not telling me if they're staying in those jobs. It's not telling me if they're making minimum wage or living wage in those jobs. It's also not telling me, I do something, every time I work with a client, I do something I call the ISIS test. And I'm like, great, you graduated, or you've placed 100,000 people in jobs. What if they're ISIS supporters? Have you reached your impact or not, right? I mean, so the idea is to go a little bit deeper and understanding what is the change that you created for them. Are they economically independent? Are they self-sufficient? Are they making living wage or minimum wage? Are they able to grow in their jobs or not? Do they have financial mobility? And most importantly, even with Luminous, what we're working on now is the cost of the outcome, right? Because we want to see how efficient we are in achieving that outcome. So what's the cost, not just of graduating someone, but placing them in a decent job that pays living wage and where they stay in it for more than a year, and that has income mobility of X, amount over a certain number of years. And this is where it becomes really insightful in terms of what do we measure, right? Because that will ensure that the design of the programs is actually based on making sure that we're achieving that outcome in the most efficient way possible. And so this is truly what we're trying to focus on the measurement. What we're trying to focus much more is outcomes versus inputs and outputs. Otherwise, you'll see like everywhere else in the Arab world, like we spend $100 million here and there on trying to create change, and then the change is not happening because we're measuring the input of 100 million, the output that we had 100 million people that benefited from it, but nothing's changed because we're not measuring the outcome.
Absolutely. I think, Reem, that it's been actually called for by international organizations for the longest time. I mean, during my tenure with IFC, we were also working on that. During my tenure with European Commission funded programs, they would always refer to the log framework for measuring. But I think that there is always this confusion between what's an output and what's an outcome. And this is, I think, a major challenge. And this is where experts like yourself come in with WISE. And in the interest of time, I would just like to flag that we are actually running out of time. I know there's so much, there's a wealth of information we want to share. So I'd just like to remind the audience if they'd like to share any questions they have. We already have one question. So before I move on to my panelists again, I'd like to ask Mary if there are any professional credentials or certifications that individuals can seek to become knowledgeable in the field of impact-driven businesses and CSR in specific. This is in the goal of eventually providing consultancy services to businesses. So are you aware of any certifications or professional credentials?
That's great, because that's what we are trying to do. So you can come and join us. Well, I'm glad that this particular attendee is inspired to do something like this. So in terms of credentials, the resources that I would suggest would be Social Value International. We are a member and they offer certain courses. I don't know if this person is in Jordan. SDG Impact, which Rasha just mentioned, Reem just mentioned, which Rasha is managing under UNZP, is actually offering a lot of really interesting courses. So over the past year and a half, I've taken an impact management and measurement course and a blended finance course with them. I would also suggest that you look at the GIN, the Global Impact Investing Network. So that's GIIN. And there's a lot of courses online, honestly. I mean, I just finished a Wharton course on SDGs in business, and this was an online course. I mean, there's plenty of resources out there. One thing I would suggest, because I really feel like we are living at a time of urgency, I wouldn't spend sort of your time only learning theoretically. I actually have learned some theory, but I've also learned through doing. So I didn't study fund management. I have 3 degrees in law and political science, but I learned how to manage a fund through managing a fund. So I would learn also by doing. And if you're interested maybe in an internship with us, you know, we could talk about that, but try and find a way to actually get into the field and learn at the same time. And I would also say, always go back to the why, which Reem always reminds us. So that book, for example, The Purpose of Capital, just always keep it in your mind, because I feel like as impact investors, like sometimes we just focus on what is the technical thing, you know, what are the returns, how many, but why are we doing this? We have to always remember, you know, why are we doing this? So I would suggest 3 things: the resources I mentioned, actually doing the practical work, and always remembering sort of the more philosophical umbrella.
Awesome. So the questions have also started coming in. We have a question for Reem about suggesting, how do you suggest quantifying and measuring impact? Does WISE actually work with the company to define the questions and how to measure against them?
Yes, we do. We do. We use international standards. We use industry best practices, but we actually do workshops. And we have templates now. We created templates to work with the companies to help them come up with their own impact model and impact map and truly measure the change that they want to be creating, but also to identify the correlations they think and the insights they want to be looking at. And so if they want to see the relationship between you know, training and economic performance, so we've actually managed to create a data structure that allows you to see that kind of correlation, or training and savings and lost account, or so there are unlimited options in there. But yes, we do all of that. Again, I would say there's not one way. We have a library of 2,000 plus indicators on our platform, so I'm more than happy to connect, and there's an abundance of knowledge out there about what others are measuring in a particular industry or working on a particular topic. And so more than happy to share all of that. Having said that, with a lot of organizations, what we end up doing is measuring what they want to see based on their own impact model.
Thank you, Reem. And I mean, we had some stats that, Noura, if you ladies have an extra 5 minutes, perhaps we can quickly run through them. I mean, here we can have the debate of what is really an output, what's an outcome, and what is, but this is obviously an overall view of the impact that SITTI has created over the past years. That's only in 2019 and 2020, Noura. So if you can briefly walk us through these 2 slides so that Mary can wrap up and tell us how they actually, by telling us how they actually select companies to invest in. I think that is important. Go ahead, Noura, please.
Yeah, so in reference of time, I'll keep it very brief, but when we're looking at impact, we try to look at all our touch points. And that's really important because like I mentioned, your touch points can be one person, but that one person has that impact, or, kind of reaching or creating partnerships can be one element, but there's obviously a stream. So for us, the term employment was not enough. It was long-term sustainable employment, because it wasn't enough to give someone a quick one-off job, because this is something that some of these communities have just been part of for way too long. It was looking at how can we create sustainable means of long-term employment for these communities, and then that kind of set the pillar for us when we were thinking as a company for scale and growth. Because scaling growth meant that it wasn't just a matter of maximum, just increasing the number so it looks good on paper, but really, like, is it actually creating an impact, or are we actually doing proper outputs, if you might say, mere than just saying, like, we hired 1,000 women, but hired 1,000 women that are paid fairly with consistent, let's say, hourly wage, et cetera, et cetera. So these are some things that we kind of have set at the back of our minds when we're thinking of our direct impact and our direct kind of day-to-day operations as a company.
And these are some great numbers here on the screen. So you've actually supported in a way over 1,000 refugee families, 661 women participated in more than 2,700 combined hours of learning and skill set development. So I mean, honestly, kudos for and you're doing this all the way in North America and remotely managing it. I think this is incredible, frankly. You've also leveraged multiple corporate partnerships. How has this helped SITTI?
So I think when we're looking at SITTI, it was always a means to make sure that when we're working with people, this wasn't an aid project, this wasn't a charity project, that we were really working on creating partnerships and making sure that the companies that do, let's say, do corporate gifting with us are aligned with that means of giving back, right? I want to say majority of the time that we built partnerships was really because companies saw the direct impact that we were doing, and they wanted to contribute to that impact through the partnerships that we've had. So to date, we're in, I mean, for those that are in North America are familiar with some of these, like Well.ca, Whole Foods, the H Project at Holt Renfro, also selling through Amazon, but also our corporate clients have been huge because it was companies that directly made a conscious decision to get their corporate gifting through us. And that allowed us to, reinvest that money back into the company. And then that way companies are able to say, look, we were able to contribute to, you know, gender equality and the employability of women and refugees in the camp because we were able to make this corporate purchase as a result. And so when companies are aligned with that, in that same factor, it goes a long way. So you can say, you know, for every bar of sets sold, you've helped produce 4 hours of employment as a result. And that really goes a long way with companies that you're working with, because I know Reem talked about this in a previous conversation of like, you know, let's move beyond corporate social responsibility and kind of look at other ways that we can, you know, contribute as businesses.
And not really just look at a ticking a box exercise, but really trying to drive real impact on the ground.
Exactly.
So with that, I would just like Mary to tell us, how do you choose companies that you invest in? Do you know, there's obviously a million considerations. I've read the long brief or portfolio of 17 ventures in SITTI, but I'd love to hear from you. If there are entrepreneurs out there, what are you looking for?
Sure. Yeah, no, great. I'm going to answer that really quickly, but I just want to, the lady who asked me a question said something about CSR in her question, and I'm not sure if she's going to see my typed answer. So I think if this person is really looking to get into the world of impact, they need to not be thinking about CSR anymore. I did CSR for many years, and now I realize it's an excuse really not to do like long-term partnerships. And it's an excuse not to embed the impact in whatever business you're operating. So when you're looking to study this, like CSR is like quite passé, I would say. We don't want it anymore. We want much more real impact. Reem is laughing at me, I think. Okay, regarding our fund. So let's just talk beyond sort of our fund, because I just want entrepreneurs to be thinking more broadly. So there's a lot of investors out there, right? So you need to know, first of all, what is the investment strategy of the fund, and what is the impact thesis if there is one underlying the fund. And then you need to see, as an entrepreneur, do your values align with this particular investor, number one? Number two, what are they offering you other than money? You know, a lot of entrepreneurs don't just need money. They may need money plus access to markets. You know, how can you help me become more digital? So you really need to see, you as an entrepreneur, like, what do you actually need? Where are your values? Do they align? So for the Jordan Growth and Impact Fund, we are a growth stage investor. We follow sort of typical SEEF investment strategy, and they've been doing this for the past 30 years. They've made 500 investments. So we're looking at companies that are already quite big. They've already started exports, and they need that extra push to become global or regional. And we decided that this was the investment strategy because this is where the gap is in the Jordanian-Palestinian market. In terms of impact, we're looking at SDG 5 and 8. So creating jobs for women, youth, and people with disabilities. So that's the focus of the Jordan Fund. The Refugee Fund I've already described. We are designing an impact-first social enterprise fund, which can help social entrepreneurs that are clearly solving a social or environmental problem. For me, it was important for us to design this sort of fund to do really an impact-first fund. The Jordan Fund, the Refugee Fund are not impact-first funds. They're investment funds with a development focus. But I hope sort of the overall advice will help entrepreneurs sort of more generally when they are looking for capital and a partner.
That's great, and I hope that inshallah any entrepreneurs who are attending today will I'll make sure to include in a follow-up email your website and your contact information as well, so they can even purchase soap bars from SITTI or apply for support from Mary's side, or even address WISE for impact measurement. I think we can walk away from this session today saying that we truly can't continue business as usual. We need to be looking at the shared value. We need to measure what we do and do it purposefully, intentionally, and there is a clear correlation between sustainable businesses and growth. So yes, perhaps, Mary, we will be seeing an SDG, a new set of, or a revised list of sustainable development goals very soon. I thank you very much, ladies, for your time today. This has been amazing. I already see great feedback from the attendees, which has come through my screen, but also on Twitter. Thank you so much for your time, and be safe, be well, take care.
Thank you.